At the root of the issue was the succession struggle in ZANU-PF. And that struggle involved, at one point or another, Joyce Mujuru, Grace Mugabe, and Emmerson Mnangagwa. Initially, Joyce Mujuru was removed by Mugabe in 2014, succeeded then by Emmerson Mnangagwa, who became vice president and looked to be set to become the president. Mnangagwa then fell out with Grace Mugabe, and what happened is that towards the end of last year, ZANU-PF as a party was heading for the ZANU-PF Congress in December. It was now November. It was very likely that Grace Mugabe was going to become vice president at that Congress, and she would then be a shoo-in to become president. So essentially the military realized that they had about 1 month to stop Grace Mugabe becoming vice president and president. So that's what triggered that real sense of urgency, because of course by then Mnangagwa had been sacked by Mugabe, and the military were also aware that it was likely that if Grace Mugabe became vice president, it was likely that there would then be a purge of the military themselves. So in a way, part of it was self-preservation, but also part of it was because they were very upset with how she and others in what's called the G40 group had been talking about the military and being disrespectful. So it's partly self-preservation, partly an anger that they felt marginalized by this other faction in ZANU-PF, and also I think partly there was a real sense, Zimbabwe's economy had deteriorated again. There was an economic crisis, political crisis. So there was also, I think, a sense by the military that we need to save Zimbabwe from economic collapse. And the only way to do it is to intervene militarily, prevent Grace Mugabe from becoming vice president, and bring in Emmerson Mnangagwa, who for a long, long time has been seen as the successor to Mugabe. I grew up in Zimbabwe. Certainly Zimbabwe's education, health system, of course, a lot of it has deteriorated in more recent years, but in the early years, we had free education, health. We had one of the best health and education systems in the world, and even now, Zimbabweans are still amongst the most successful people globally, and part of that is part of Mugabe's achievements during his time. So there is a positive legacy of professionalism, of uplifting and development, but there is, of course, a very negative legacy, the legacy of political violence against the opposition. For instance, Morgan Tsvangirai passed away very recently. He was one of those among many hundreds who was abused, tortured by the state. There was also what is known as the Kukura Hundi in the 1980s in Matabeleland. Thousands of civilians were killed by the military, and this was during Mugabe's term. He knew about it. So there's that legacy of political violence. There's also a legacy of economic uncertainty. Zimbabwe's economy in the 2000s, between 2000 and 2009, Zimbabwe's economy became one of the worst performing in the world. Our currency became worthless. Literally, it became one of the poorest, worst economies since, it's been likened to the Weimar Republic in the 1930s in Germany. Our currency became that worthless. People were moving around with bags of money. Everybody technically was a millionaire or a trillionaire, but the money was worthless. And that happened on Mugabe's watch. So there is that mixed legacy. The land issue is also a mixed legacy. It was done, the land redistribution was done, it was a violent process. People were displaced forcibly from the land, but there is a positive side to it, which is that many of the African people, the black people who had never had access to land, were given land. The land wasn't just given to the political elite. Ordinary people also received land, and many of those people still have the land today. So, as with many things, it's a complex and very mixed legacy that Mugabe has. He's seen by some as an Pan-Africanist icon across the continent, and seen by others as a real despot. So it's a very mixed legacy. But overall, what is very clear and what is absolutely definite is that he certainly has been one of Zimbabwe's most influential leaders since independence. There's no question about that. In fact, he's probably been the most influential leader in Zimbabwe and even in the region, because he's had a regional impact since independence, for better and in some cases for worse.
What do you think was the core of his influence? Why people just trusted him? So what was special about him as a leader?
I think it was that he was fearless. Mugabe spoke his mind, whether you agreed with him or not. And for many also that he stood up to the West, especially in the 2000s. He stood up, he attacked Tony Blair, he attacked George Bush. He stood up to the West. It got him into a lot of trouble. He was attacked relentlessly. But other people around the world thought, he's been fearless. He stood up for the West. He stood up for what he believed in. It wasn't always the right thing, but, he stood up for it. And I think people, whether you agreed with what he said or not, and, we often disagreed with some of the things, but at least with Mugabe, you knew where you stood. He was not someone who minced his words or was ambiguous. He said exactly what he believed in, and he said what he said he would do is what he did. And I think that got him a sense of respect. I mean, when he would go to South Africa or places around Africa, he would receive, in some cases, standing ovation from the crowd, who kind of respected him as a Pan-Africanist leader. But of course, as we know, there were some very bad things that Mugabe and his government did, particularly, as I say, with regard to violence. There was a violent aspect to Mugabe and to ZANU-PF, which I think is one of the unfortunate legacies of his time in office.
And what is the current situation in Zimbabwe?
Okay, we've had quite a dramatic shift. As you know, Mugabe was removed from power both by the military and the party. We have a new president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was Mugabe's right-hand man for many, many years. But what's been interesting is that Mnangagwa has not taken the kind of hardline, radical, ideological approach. Mnangagwa has been very pragmatic. All his pronunciations and his agenda is of economic liberalization and economic reform. That has been his agenda. So that is very different from Mnangagwa has not been ideological. He's more of a pragmatist and he knows with elections coming up, he's got to sort out Zimbabwe's economic crisis. So we have a new president who generally, I would say, has been welcomed by the global community, both the East and the West. But we are headed for elections, which have to be there by the end of July this year. Mnangagwa still has to get national support for himself. So, he does have an advantage going into elections because, of course, he's the incumbent, the state, they control the state machinery. But there are still people who say, well, Mnangagwa was part of the Mugabe system. So not everyone trusts Mnangagwa. There's an element of a question of trust among various, but I would say at the moment he probably has the advantage. Also, I think what is unfortunate for the opposition is that their leader, Morgan Tsvangirai, passed away just a couple of days ago. And that, I think, has thrown the largest opposition party, the Movement for Democratic Change, into disarray. We're seeing infighting going on. So the opposition at the moment are at a disadvantage. And also because the opposition in recent elections, the opposition's strong point has been that their claim that we are the people to fix Zimbabwe's economy. We will do economic liberalization. We will do economic reform. That had been the opposition's electoral agenda. Now what's happened is that Mnangagwa has seized that, and he is the one saying, I'm doing economic reform, I'm doing economic liberalization. So the opposition now has a problem of defining what it is that they stand for and what is going to be their main their main electoral argument. That is a real question for the opposition, because Mnangagwa is now doing many of the things which the opposition had said needed to be done. So the opposition themselves have some work to do to convince the electorate.
What is the current investment climate in Zimbabwe? Do you think big corporations are interested in coming to Zimbabwe?
Well, just in the last few months, certainly there's been, the big thing that the new Mnangagwa government did is that they have reformed the indigenization law. Because the indigenization law, which said that any foreign investment in Zimbabwe needed to have 51% ownership by the locals and 49% by the foreign investors. That has been completely revamped. It now only applies to two areas of the economy. I think to parts of mining and something else. But other than that, foreign investors are now able to come in, and there isn't that kind of rigid indigenization act, and that has attracted quite a lot of investment interest. We are seeing a lot of companies, even from the UK, coming, and what the government has done is that, and Mnangagwa said, we're open for business. So the government is re-engaging. There's always been a look east policy with, ZANU-PF has for a long time been friendly with Russia, China, and other Asian countries. But the government also now is looking west. Mnangagwa was at Davos. So we're seeing a lot of interest from investors in the West as well, and across Africa. So generally the investment climate, I think, is much improved. Not everyone is convinced, it has to be said. Some people are taking a kind of wait and see approach. They want to see how the elections go, because that's another big test which the government has to go through. Will we have genuinely free and fair elections? And a lot will depend on that. But at the moment, I would say just in these last few months, there's been far more interest in Zimbabwe and investment and economy than there has been in the last 5 or 6 years. There's a genuine interest, but a lot of it will depend on the elections. If we have a very messy elections which turn out to be divisive, with the results being contested, then that will pull the economy back. That unfortunately has been our tradition in the last few years, in which our elections have been an economic liability and not an economic asset. The hope is that this time around, our elections will be an economic asset. Tsvangirai's death is a national loss. Whether people agreed with his politics or not, he certainly has done a lot for Zimbabwe's politics. He's helped to change Zimbabwe, no question about it. And certainly he is, I said Mugabe is probably the most influential Zimbabwean leader since independence. But you've also got to mention Tsvangirai, who himself, I think, has been one of the leading politicians since independence. It is now problematic for the opposition. Tsvangirai, of course, is a national icon. He was a people's champion, I would say. But he leaves behind a very divided party and a divided opposition. We are seeing the MDCs already fighting. They're fighting each other. There were 3 vice presidents, Nelson Chamisa, Thokozani Kupe, and Elias Mudzuri. And they've also their Secretary General, Douglas Monzora. Nelson Chamisa was appointed by the National Council just a few days ago, following Tsvangirai's death, as the acting president. But that appointment has been contested within the party and by Tsvangirai's family. So going into election, whilst Chamisa, I think, probably will be leading the party, but he's got a very divided party. There's also supposed to be an opposition coalition of parties headed, which Changirai was the head of. Chamisa again now has to prove himself that he can head that party. And as I said, probably the biggest problem for them is that Mnangagwa has fast-forwarded the economic reform agenda, which the opposition themselves had tried to claim. So, you know, they're facing a resurgent ZANU-PF and Emerson Mnangagwa. So it's a very difficult process. It's not impossible, because Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF have their own internal issues still ongoing. But it's a very difficult task, I think, for the opposition going into these elections. They're short of resources. They're fractured internally. So it's going to be difficult, I think, for the opposition in these elections to win outright. I think if they are able to reduce ZANU-PF's majority in parliament, they will have done very well. But it's hard to see Nelson Chamisa winning the presidential election against Emerson Mnangagwa. And there are other opposition politicians contesting. Joyce Mujuru, there's there's Nkosana Moya, there are other people. So it will be interesting to see how well the opposition do.
Are there any chances that property and land has ever been returned to the owners?
It's an ongoing debate, the land issue. Under Mugabe made it very clear that there would be no going back. There would be nothing given back to the white farmers. But what's happened in the last few years, and this was actually even during the last year of Mugabe's tenure, but it's more so under Mnangagwa, is that there have been discussions with the white commercial farmers and others on the land question. We still have a big land question. And the government has committed to compensation for the farmers who were removed from their land. So there's been a commitment to compensation. The question of returning land back to the farmers is much more contentious because it's a political issue. And I think going into elections, government would not want to be seen as saying we're now going to reverse the land process, because they know that would cost them electorally. But what is important and what is good is that government has said we don't want any more land invasions, because this has been an ongoing issue. So government has now said no, we're not going to allow any more land invasions, and I think that has been an important step forward, because you've had all this time, Zimbabwe's white farming community has shrunk from about 3,000 commercial farmers to probably to less than 500 now, and those who are left had still been subjected to intermittent invasions by war veterans and so on and so forth. Government now has said no more land invasions. Let's talk about, and government has said let's have a national land dialogue. So I think that has been very, very important. I don't think the farmers are going to be wholesale given back their land, but I think there will be discussions around land compensation. There needs to be a land audit, because especially a lot of the elite have got 4 or 5 farms, some of which they don't even use. And that land can be, those farms I think can be used more productively by people who know. So I think what we are now seeing is a more professional approach to the land issue. And what is, I think, very good is that it's becoming post-racial. Our land issue had been very, very racial, white versus black. Now it's becoming post-racial. Zimbabweans are coming together and saying, no, we have a land question, and let's resolve this issue without going into race and white versus black. So I think that is an important step forward. There's been an acknowledgement by government that mistakes were made in the land issue. It needed to happen because there was an unequal distribution of land, but the process and some of the outcome, government has admitted that mistakes have been made and that we need to revisit it. So I think overall, I think that is an important, compared to just 5 or 6 years ago when it was a taboo topic, I think a lot of progress has been made. But one hopes that there will be a resolution to this issue, because we cannot have people, with 5 or 6 farms, some of which are underutilized or not even used at all, whilst there are others, professionals, who are not allowed to use the land simply because of their race. I think we have to move beyond that.